All right, we're studying the life of Joseph. And thus far, we've looked at the birth of Joseph, which was in chapter 30. We looked at he was born into great turmoil and division within his family. He was also born with the affections of his father and mother in favor. He was born with great expectations, just like Sarah and Abraham, and then Isaac and Rebekah. Rachel was barren until years later. So he's following that pattern, and he is supposed to be a child that God will do great things in. And then also even Jacob himself associates Joseph with God's promises. Then we looked at a brief glimpse of Joseph's childhood in 33, where we saw that he was growing up in great wealth, where God was blessing Jacob. And he was growing up with favoritism. As Jacob lined up his children when he was going to meet Esau, he put Rachel and Joseph last. And thus that was the beginning of the growing up under resentment from his brothers. Then last week we looked at the next 10 years from chapter 33 all the way to 37:1, where we saw evidence that Jacob was worshiping Yahweh. He was building altars and presumably teaching to worship God and God's ways. But right from the beginning, at their stay in Sukkoth, we saw that the father was deceiving Esau and giving a model for his children to get out of danger. Well, we just can deceive and we can lie. Next, we saw their stay in Shechem, where the brothers followed the pattern of their father and deceived the men there after their daughter was hurt and violated and taken advantage of, and they murdered every male there, then took all of the property and all the women and children. Then the third move was the travel southward, where Joseph's mother dies. His oldest brother, Reuben, commits immorality. And then his grandfather, whom he's finally reunited with, he dies. So we see a lot of turmoil, a lot of sadness within the family. And we see in those 10 years that the eldest 3 children are shown to be less than men of character and men of God. So chapter 37 focuses on Joseph. In the beginning of the narrative communicates the rise of Joseph, where we're seeing his rise in his love from his father, but also in parallel the hatred of his brothers. We saw that his father gave him special privilege, special favor, and it was clearly shown by the special coat that he was given that he would be the heir. He would be the one in charge of the whole family. And his father was grooming him for that. And that brought about hatred and jealousy from his other brothers. And then verses 5 through 11, we saw that Joseph had dreams. So not only was he favored by his father, but he was being favored by God. Dreams were thought of, especially at that time, to be divine revelation. In his first dream and his second dream, they pictured both the same message. They communicated that Joseph was going to rise in power and authority over the entire family. And the brothers hated him all the more for it. And his father even rebukes him. So at the end of last week, in chapter 11, we see Joseph's rise in privilege and authority and position. And yet at the same time, there's that parallel isolation and hatred and animosity. But he's also growing in divine favor. So this week, we're going to look at the life of Joseph, a brother rejected, part 2, which we're going to finish the chapter today, going from verses 12 through 36. And this week, we're going to look at the next 3 narrative blocks that communicate his story. So the first block in the narrative is verses 12 through 17, Joseph's mission. Now this block contains 2 parts. The first part is where Joseph is sent by his father Jacob, verses 12 through 14. Let's go ahead and read 12 and 13. It says, "Then his brothers went to pasture their father's flock in Shechem. Israel said to Joseph, 'Are not your brothers pasturing the flock in Shechem? Come, and I will send you to them.' And he said to his father, 'I will go.' So we see that Joseph and Jacob are down here, south of Hebron in this region, and his brothers are shepherding all the way up here near Shechem, which is about 50 miles apart. Now, why are they way up there? Well, it's probable that this is the end of summer or late summer where things are drying up in Israel, and especially in this area it gets drier, and this area is known for being lush and have good fields for pasturing and grazing. So they're probably pasturing up there because of the time period. Now notice, although last time Joseph gave a bad report of his brothers and their handling of the sheep and the flocks, obviously that was dealt with, and his father corrected them, and they continue to tend to Jacob's flocks. So it's interesting also, you notice Joseph is not with them. All his brothers are out pasturing, probably not Benjamin either, but Joseph is not with him. He's home with his father. Now, this is probably because he is given that special status. He is moved into a middle management position, and it's shown by his fancy coat. But notice how Joseph responds to Jacob's request. He's home, he's being trained, presumably, and he tells him to go 50 miles to go visit, see how the flocks are doing, see how his brothers are doing. At the age of 17, what is a typical answer or response of a 17-year-old? I'm tired. I don't want to. Joseph says, yeah, I'll go. It shows a faithful character. The narrative is giving us that idea that Joseph is being faithful and loyal to his father, just like he was last time when he gave a bad report, saying that they were not handling his father's property and the responsibility and obedience to the father the way they should be. In verse 14, it says, then he said to him, go now and see about the welfare of your brothers and the welfare of the flock, and bring word back to me. So he sent him from the valley of Hebron, and he came to Shechem. And now this is a picture of today's sheep actually pasturing in Shechem. But notice the words here that Jacob uses. He says, see about the welfare of your brothers and the welfare of the sheep. In Hebrew, that word is actually shalom, which is a word for peace. And it echoes what we've already seen in the narrative last week, where in verse 4 it says, his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his other brothers, so they hated him and could not speak to him on friendly terms, on peaceful terms. The word shalom is used there. And that's a specific tie and connection in the narrative because although his father is sending him to find out how the peace is going, how their peace is, what do we expect? There won't be any peace between them. So therefore, we're not expecting a good encounter. Thus, the suspense of the narrative grows. Now, what we have here is we have one of the first youth groups ever recorded in Scripture. And they're in the north. There's a little bit older youth that is managing and controlling the rest of the younger youth without parental supervision, which is down here. So already we know that things are probably not going to go well. It's a recipe for trouble. And when Joseph reaches Shechem, he has a chance encounter. Verses 15 through 17. 15 and 16 say, a man found him, and behold, he was wandering in the field. And the man asked him, what are you looking for? And he said, I'm looking for my brothers. Please tell me where they are pasturing the flock. So this is Shechem. So he's somewhere in this region. He's wandering around. Do you notice this scene seems a little odd? Does it fit the narrative? He's supposed to find his brothers. We expect him what? To find his brothers. But yet he's here where his brothers are supposed to be, and they're not. And this scene, although it's odd, it communicates a very key theme of Joseph's story, and especially of this chapter. So while Joseph is literally wandering, that word is often used of sheep. He's wandering in the field like a sheep, and an unnamed man finds him. Is this simply a coincidence? Is this happening by chance? No. When Joseph asks where his brothers are, the man tells him. And then the man said, they have moved from here, for I heard them say, let us go to Dothan. So Joseph went after his brothers and found them in Dothan. Now, Dothan means two wells. It's a very fertile land. It's about 14 miles away. So when Joseph is going there, he's now 63 miles away from Hebron, approximately. So Joseph is moving further away from safety of his father and closer into harm's way. It's building suspense and anxiety in the narrative. And notice, without the direction of this unnamed man that he found and had a chance meeting with in a field, Joseph would have never found them. If he was here, which way do you go? He would have never found them. So, notice, what are the chances of this man, number one, meeting Joseph in the field, speaking to Joseph in the field, and then this man actually overheard the brothers and where they're going and directs Joseph to the exact location? It's not good. The chances are slim. Without that direction, Joseph would have never have found them. And what this is telling us in the narrative is that God has sovereignly directed Joseph into the situation. So even though it is quite a terrible situation, God is leading Joseph there. Now, Joseph is still making decisions, and we are all responsible for our decisions. He's responsible to obey his father and to obey God. But God is in control of the effects. God is in control on how our choices affect the world around us. So we are responsible for our decisions, and God will bring about the results in the world. Which brings us to our next narrative block, which is the brothers' rejection of Joseph, verses 18 through 28. This narrative block has three scenes, the first of which is the plot to murder. Verse 18 through 20 says, when they saw him from a distance, and before he came close to them, they plotted against him to put him to death. And they said to one another, here comes this dreamer. Now then, come, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. And we will say, a wild beast devoured him. Then let us see what will become of his dreams. So notice verse 18, they see him. They see him from a distance. Now how are they going to know it's Joseph? Well, he has a uniquely colored coat that identifies him as their brother and the dreamer. And notice they call him this dreamer. In Hebrew, it's actually, look, here comes the master of dreams. Now, dreamer is a perfect description and translation, but it communicates they're really mocking him, right? He's the dreamer. And what do they say? Now, come, let us kill him. This shows premeditation. This is not an emotional outburst or emotional reaction. They are planning to murder him. It shows the state of their heart. So they plan to kill him and throw him into one of the pits. Now, what's a pit? A pit is a cistern where the limestone of the bedrock was hollowed out, or a big hole was dug out and it was lined with plaster. This is what it would look like from under the ground. This is what it looks like from the top. And a lot of times they would put a stone over the top of it. And what they use these things for is to collect rainwater. In Israel, it rains. You've heard of the early and later rains. The early rains would be in the fall. It rains all winter. And then the latter rains are the spring rains that taper off. And then in the summer, it is dry and hot. So water is hard to come by. So during those rainy seasons, they basically have rain barrels underground. They collect all the rain and they put a rock over it. When they need to get it, they get it. So once again, this was probably late summer because at least some of these pits are empty. And sometimes they use the pits when they're empty as prison cells. In this case, though, the brothers want to use it as a tomb. They want to kill the brother and then throw him in a pit to get rid of him. So notice their jealousy and their hostility in this narrative, it's directed towards the dreams that God has given Joseph. And specifically, it's Joseph's dream that communicated that he will one day rule over them. So their jealousy has caused them to hate Joseph. And now, given the opportunity, their character comes out. Their true character comes out. That adage is, an axiom is true, that one's true character is revealed when no one's watching. And what's their character? They're envious, they're lying, and they're murderers. And this is something that they've been hiding. Because if Jacob had seen this in them, and their attitude towards Joseph, their immense hatred, and if Jacob thought that they could ever do such things, he would have never sent Joseph by himself. And we know this because Jacob was cautious. He was extremely cautious with Esau. And that whole event saw that he errs on the side of caution. So they've been hiding it. But now, when there's no supervision, when they're by themselves, when they're in charge, when they can do what they want to do, their character comes out. Now, there's a play on words here in Hebrew where it says, a wild beast devoured them. The word for wild is correct when it's modifying beast, but this word for wild is literally in Hebrew the word for evil. And it's evil when it's used of humans. So, there's a great irony here. So they are going to say that evil beasts or wild beasts devoured him. In this story, who are the wild beasts? Who is the wild beast? It's them. They are the ones. So they're speaking truly. But they don't understand all the words. Okay, the second scene contains a plot to regain favor. Verses 21 through 24. Okay, so the first plot was motivated by hatred and jealousy. And the second one is motivated by selfish gain. It says that, but Reuben heard this and rescued him out of their hands and said, let us not take his life. Reuben further said to them, shed no blood. Throw him into this pit that is in the wilderness, but don't lay hands on him, that he might, and this is a thought within himself, that he might rescue him out of their hands to restore him to his father. Okay, so now Reuben's plan is to save his life, and he's going to use the pit. Now, in Reuben's mind, I'm going to use the pit as a prison cell, as a holding cell, where I can come later on and let him out. But he's concealing his true motives. To his brothers, he's saying, okay, don't you kill him, throw him in the pit, and then we'll go away. Well, isn't that going to kill him as well? He's going to starve in there. He can't get out of the pit. There's no way you can climb out of those pits once you're in, not by yourself. So they're going to leave him there to starve. So, in essence, they are going to kill him. They are responsible for his murder. But for some odd way, they are distinguishing killing directly and killing indirectly. So it says that Reuben rescued him out of their hands. When the scriptures talk about hands, a lot of times it refers to authority or power over. So their power over Joseph, which is obviously, again, playing on the words that Joseph was given a position by his father and by God as having power over them, but they're showing through their human might and sin that they are stronger. Now, Reuben, he's the oldest, so he is actually responsible for what happens, and he is responsible for the actions of his other brothers. So he is planning to return Joseph to Jacob, presumably to get praise and to show that he has the ability to lead. But notice, is there any mention of God here? Is there any motive to say, hey, we can't kill him, that's against God. We can't do that, that's murder. No, there's none of that. Let's not lay hands on him. Let's not take the full responsibility. So it came about when Joseph reached his brothers that they stripped Joseph of his tunic, the vari-colored tunic that was on him. And they took him and threw him into the pit. Now the pit was empty, without any water in it. Okay, so when finally, this is all planned out beforehand as Joseph was coming. So when Joseph came, he was greeted by unwelcome hands and unwelcome arms. And they removed his tunic. That is a symbolic act of removing his favor and his authority over them. And they threw him in a pit, which A, must have hurt, and 2, it is also a symbolic act of the one who was elevated above them, they threw down beneath them. So now it says, notice at the end it says, now the pit was empty without any water in it. This is a side note from the author. And it's to clarify because these cisterns usually had water in them. They held water. And if you threw someone in a pit like that had water in it, there's nowhere to, you couldn't only tread water for so long. You would die, you would drown. So Moses here is concerned with credibility, letting us know exactly, normally in these circumstances you would drown. But he's saying, no, there's no water in it. So he fell to the ground, to the bottom. Now, typically also in these cisterns, because they're collecting the runoff rainwater, almost like gutter water, there's usually always some dirt that go down. Have you heard in the scripture where it says, take me out of the miry clay? That's going to be the dirt sediments that are built up on the bottom. So at least Joseph fell probably into a little bit softer ground, but we're not told any of that. So Reuben's plan saved Joseph's life, but there was also the plot to make a few shekels. Verses 25 through 28. 25 says, then they sat down to eat a meal. And they raised their eyes and looked, and behold, a caravan of Ishmaelites were coming from Gilead, with their camels, bearing aromatic gum and balm and myrrh, on their way to bring them down to Egypt. Okay, their brother is in a pit, left to die, and they're sitting down to eat? And it's possibly the food that Joseph brought to them? Sitting down usually is a calming, peaceful thing. I'm done. I can rest. It shows their callousness towards evil. And it's stunning. It shows that they have no conscious thought of what's right and wrong before God. They have no fear. It shows their character again. So here they're sitting down and they raise up their eyes and they see these Ishmaelites. Now Ishmaelites, remember, those are descendants of Abraham's other son from Hagar, who is Ishmael. And Ishmael remember, God blessed Hagar and said, out of Ishmael I'll raise up many nations as well. And thus out of Ishmael was numerous nomadic tribes. And these are some of them here. And their camels are carrying the gum, the balm, and the myrrh. Now these in Hebrew are very rare terms, so the exact plants and the exact things they're talking about is really uncertain. But the suggestions have been ladanum, mastic trees, storac trees, and then citrus or rock rose. And these things, either by cutting the trunks of the trees or the branches and letting the sap come out, that would produce a certain kind of what's called resin, which is flammable, but has a sweet smell, and it's a resin that is not soluble with water. Some of these things could produce gums, which would be the scraping of the leaves, which is soluble in water, and for the same reasons. All of these substances coming from any of these trees or bushes, they were valuable substances that were not found in Egypt, and they were used primarily as medicines. But they were also used as incense and perfumes. But for the most part, it was medicine, so it was very valuable and very prized. And from ancient texts, we know that this is a common commodity that's brought down to Egypt. And in fact, when Jacob goes down to Egypt later on in Genesis, he brings some of these things down as gifts. Okay, so continuing on in verse 26, it says, Joseph said to his brothers, all right, what profit is it for us to kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, and let us sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him, for he's our brother, our own flesh. And his brothers listened to him. Then some Midianites, traders, passed by, so they pulled him up and lifted Joseph out of the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver. Thus, they brought Joseph into Egypt. Okay, so here now on the center stage is Judah. We already heard that from Reuben, Levi, and Simeon. Now it's Judah. He's the fourth in line. And we see that he is motivated by money, by greed. He's making decisions based on wealth and profit. So he's showing himself, the narrative is showing him as not being a potentially good leader either of the family. And And somehow in his mind, in his thinking, if we sell him, then we won't be guilty of his blood. It's interesting. Now he gives reasons. Now he makes a plea for Joseph's life. He's our brother. He's our flesh. We can't do this. Now he does it. Well, it's purely motivated by profit. Now, Midianites, this is some of the people in this big caravan. They were apparently descendants of Ishmael. One of the tribes are coming from them. And they set out an agreement of 20 shekels. Now, 20 shekels, why that? And why silver, not gold? Silver and gold throughout ancient worlds has been equal, or one goes above the other as far as value. And apparently silver is the most costly commodity at this time. And 20 shekels of silver, that is a standard rate for a male slave from the age of 5 to 20 in ancient texts. Leviticus 27:5. But also in Babylon, the law of Hammurabi has the same amounts. And just to give you an idea, that amount of money is about 2 years' wages. And if you're a shepherd, it might be a little bit longer. And at this time, when you're sold into slavery, you're typically not released. It's a lifetime sentence. So, as a side note, before we go on, what is Joseph doing during all this? The narrative tells us nothing about Joseph. The text is oddly quiet. And it does so to keep the focus on the brothers, on what they're doing. But we actually hear about it later on. In Genesis 42:21 it says, "Then they, the brothers, said to one another," this is while they're in Egypt and in angst about knowing that this is their brother, "Truly we are guilty concerning our brother, because we saw the distress of his soul when he pleaded with us, yet we would not listen." So, to the historical picture, this is incredible. Here's Joseph pleading with them for his life, and his soul is utterly in dismay and distress. Falls on deaf ears. Brothers don't care at all. They hate him that much. Their hatred blinded them. So, in this narrative block, we see 3 motivating factors for men to commit wicked actions: jealousy, personal benefit, and profit. These 3 motivations are often justifications for doing evil and wickedness. And they should never be among the people of God. And this narrative is showing us how ugly it is, how destructive, how harmful, and how we must be careful about our motives for doing things. When we're angry or hating or jealousy of someone, that should not motivate us. That shouldn't be driving our actions or behavior. For personal benefit, gaining favor in someone else's eyes, that should not cause us to do evil. And getting a profit, making money, that should not be a motivation for doing evil as well. So this scene is horrific. And we don't like to think that people could act this way. But that's the point of the text. The word brother in this chapter 37, is repeated 21 times. And it's given that, it's repeated over and over to bring a shock value to the reader. Because brothers don't act this way. This is shameful. This is horrific. Even on secular terms, this is horrific. This is not the way God has designed the family to act and to function. The family unit should be a place of protection, of support, of loyalty, and of love. But all too often, among siblings, it's the opposite. Have you ever acted out of anger or jealousy, or wanting to gain mommy's approval or daddy's approval, or wanting to make some money and put your other brothers and sisters down? Has your actions been not godly towards them? You all in godly families need to be obedient to God and to make your homes, you have that responsibility and that honor and that privilege to represent God and to bless your brothers and your sisters by protecting them, by supporting them, by being loyal to them, and to love them. God has given you that ability to bless another. And that is a great privilege, which we see is obviously not happening here. But that is the point. It's to drive us in the other direction. Okay, the third narrative block continues with the brothers deceive their father Jacob. Verses 29 through 35. Now remember, Reuben's plan was to rescue Joseph and return him. Well, now Reuben returns to the pit, and behold, Joseph's not in the pit. So he tore his garments. He returned to his brothers and said, "The boy's not there. As for me, where am I to go?" So he tears his garments. It symbolizes a extreme distress and mourning. In this case, it's extreme distress, anger. Now remember, he is responsible for what's going on. So he's going to be the one who has to answer his father. So he must have been separated at some distance, which is logical. If they have a huge herd, they probably all go out into different areas and then come back together in the evening at a mealtime. So he's out and he's away, and he must have been gone for hours because he doesn't see them talking to the caravan, and the caravan is long gone by the time he gets back and realizes that Joseph is gone. Because if he's that concerned and the caravan was just down the road, he could go follow them and get his brother back. But they're gone. There's no way. And in fact, in Jewish tradition, from the Jewish historian Josephus, first century Jewish historian, he says that Reuben came back at nighttime at the cover of darkness so that he could release his brother without being seen. So that's a real possibility. So he returned. It's interesting that he goes to the pit where Joseph was supposed to be, and then he returns to his brothers. So they are even meeting somewhere else. They don't even care. They want to hear Joseph. They don't want to see him. They're somewhere else, all together somewhere else. They left the area. And they're probably in their meeting place at night having dinner. And notice how Reuben addresses them. He says, "the boy." In Hebrew, that's the word for youth. It's still, he's seeing him as the smaller one, the young one, the one that I'm responsible for. The boy is gone. And as for me, where am I to go? He's not saying where do I go to find him. He's saying, where am I going to go? Because I can't go home and tell this to Dad. I can't say in front of Jacob that Joseph is gone. I'm responsible. Where am I going to go? Okay, next verse. So they took Joseph's tunic and slaughtered a male goat and dipped the tunic in blood. And they sent the vari-colored tunic and brought it to their father and said, "We found this. Please examine it to see if whether it is your son's tunic or not." Okay, what do? Is their plan to be honest and good and come right out and confess? No, of course not, because sin begets sin. They're in this path and they're just continuing full on. And they slaughter a male goat. Why a male goat? Well, they're less valuable. Female goats, they produce young and they produce milk. So let's just get one of the male ones. And they dip his tunic in the blood and they send it ahead. It's probably that because of the herd is big, they're going in different groups back, and they send it on ahead, and they're following. But when they get there, they all bring it into their father. And they said, "We found this." Lie. They're lying directly to their father. They didn't find it. They produced it. And notice how they say it. "We found this. Please examine it to see whether it is your sons." That's distancing language. Your sons. It's not our brother, Joseph. He has a name. They all know it. So they allow Jacob to come to the false conclusion, which he does. Verse 33 says, "Then he examined it and said, 'It is my son's tunic. A wild beast has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces.'" Notice the irony there is repeated. Because who is the wild or evil beast that devoured Joseph? Well, it's the brothers. And their plan worked. Their plan deceived their father. His anger or upset attitude. His wrath is not on them. So notice their plan. A goat was slaughtered, and a man's tunic was used to deceive their father. Have we heard of that story before? When Jacob and Rebekah wanted the blessing of Isaac to come to Jacob instead of Esau, they killed 2 goats and used their skins to cover Jacob's skin, and they used Esau's clothes to put on Jacob so he would smell like Esau, and they used those things to deceive their father. So we see history is repeating itself. So it seems like the brothers got away with it. They didn't get into trouble, and suspicion was not on them. Everything went according to plan. But how would their deception affect Jacob? What was his reaction? Had they even thought about that? The sons were really only concerned about themselves because they caused the deepest sorrow. Verse 34 and 35. 34 says, "So Jacob tore his clothes and put sackcloth on his loins and mourned for his son many days." Here, like Reuben, he tore his clothes. But unlike Reuben, who was under distress, this is literally mourning. He tore his clothes to show that he was in mourning of the death of his son. And he put on sackcloth. Now that's a coarse material made out of goat or camel hair. It was uncomfortable and it was irritating, but it was worn for a mourning period. And probably it came about to remind the person that they can't, with my loss of my child or the someone that I love, I cannot have pleasure on earth. It's to remind them and irritate them and bring them to mind and to be sorrowful. And also sackcloth, it was something that everyone else could see and see that they were in mourning. Now customarily, they mourned for 30 days at this time, but a mourner could go as long as they needed to or wanted to. So notice in verse 35 it says, "Then all of his sons and all of his daughters arose to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. And he said, 'Surely I will go down to Sheol in mourning for my son.' So his father wept for him." Notice, all of his sons were comforting their father. So now they're concerned? I don't think they really realized the effect that their deception would have on their father. I don't think they thought that through. I don't think they thought anything past their own well-being. And sin does that. Sin is rooted in selfishness. Notice it says all his sons and all his daughters. All his daughters, we only know of one, of Dinah. This probably indicates that he had more daughters, especially during those 6 years where he was building his flock with Laban in Haran during those years, because a lot of times the birth of the girls weren't recorded. So it's probable that he has other daughters. It is also possible that some of his oldest sons had married, and these are referring to daughters-in-law, or it could be referring to both. Either way, his sons and his daughters are trying to comfort, and Jacob refused to be comforted. Because no one can compare. No one can take that hurt away of Joseph, his favored son, the one whom he was trusting into hand over the reins of the family, to be the heir, the one whom he trusted and whom was godly. He had great affections, and no one else could comfort him. What would he do now? Notice the directional literary note of "they rose, but he said, I will sink, I will go down." Pure and simple, Jacob needed time to mourn. There was nothing that they could do. He needed to mourn. Now, in the scriptures, when it uses Sheol in the Old Testament, it means one of two things, and they're both connected. One is just the grave, underneath the ground, the physical grave. But it refers to the place of the departed souls. And you can see, obviously, how they're connected. So by Jacob saying, I will go down to Sheol in mourning for my son, basically saying, I'm going to mourn over Joseph every day until I die. There is no perceivable end for the grief that Jacob is experiencing. So therefore, in their actions, the sons have not literally, metaphorically, put their father in his own pit. And it's a pit of despair. Do you see the effects of sin? The effects of hatred, of jealousy, and deception. They are never isolated. They affect other people. We cannot always see the places sin destroys, the places where it harms the lives of other people. That is why we need to trust in the Lord with all of our heart and not lean on our own understanding, but acknowledge Him in all of our ways and to trust Him and obey Him. Okay, so what of Joseph? The last verse contains the last narrative block, which is verse 36, the conclusion of Joseph, which is, meanwhile, the Midianites sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, Pharaoh's officer, the captain of the bodyguard. Now, this doesn't seem to be a good thing, but this man, Potiphar, is a man of power, and he lives in the capital. And because he was associated with Pharaoh, that would mean Joseph would know people in the inner circle of Pharaoh. The word Potiphar, the name, is shortened. It's a shortened form of Potiphera, which means in Egyptian, he whom Ra has given. Ra is the sun god. Sometimes symbolize this as the sun disk, which has wings because it flies across the sky. And this man is identified as Pharaoh's officer, the captain of the bodyguard. We know from later texts he is in control and in command of the jails, and he very well may be the chief executioner. So this is a man you don't want to mess with, a man that's of great power. But as his name represents, this is a new world. This is a new life for for Joseph. He is no longer the son of favor. No longer does he have a position of authority. He's now a slave. He no longer has his freedom. He no longer has the love of his father there with him, affecting his daily life. He is a stranger in a strange land with different gods. He is no longer in a field, living in a tent. He is in a massive city, one of the biggest cities of that time period. He's in the midst of the largest empire of that time, with different customs and different practices. Everything is different. And in one way, it really mirrors what that whole family felt like when Jacob moved them from Haran into Canaan, where everything was different and new. But you saw how the brothers reacted. This story, as we continue on, will show us how Joseph reacts, how a man who is faithful reacts and responds. Those are the four narrative blocks, and where this portion of Joseph's story ends, and a new one's about to begin. So let's go over applications. Number one, when Jacob asks his 17-year-old son to travel 50 miles, Joseph goes. Joseph is a model of a faithful and obedient son. Number two, throughout the twists and turns of these events, we see God's hand leading Joseph to where he wants him to be. The narrative is reminding us that we are responsible for our decisions in life, but God is sovereignly bringing about the results in history. Literally, Joseph's whole life is going to be an illustration of God works out all things according to our good for those who love God and those who are called according to his purpose. Number three, when Jacob's sons were free from the supervising eyes of their parents, they used that opportunity to act on their hatred. They were motivated to commit sin and wickedness by jealousy, personal benefit, and monetary gain. True character is revealed when no one's watching. What do you do when you think no one sees? Does it bring glory to God? Number four, this chapter stresses the paradox of brothers acting abhorrently towards one another in their family. This is not God's design for the family. but we often see siblings treating their brothers and sisters cruelly. The family should be a place of protection, of support, loyalty, and love. Use the life that God has given you to bring about God's design in your family. And then number 5, we cannot always see the places sin destroys in the lives of people, but it does. That is why we need to trust in the Lord with all of our hearts and be obedient children both to God and to our parents. And that is the end of A Brother Rejected, Part 2.